Montana Territory, late spring of 1879. The sky was wide and bruised with clouds as the wind dragged dust across the dry earth outside the saloon in Dead Horn Ridge. Perrie Lark stood stiff beside her father's wagon, a worn carpetbag clutched in her fingers and dread settling heavy in her chest. Her father, Walt Lark, reeked of whiskey and desperation, the same mix he always wore when gambling had gone wrong. He had not said much since they left their cabin outside of town, only that she needed to look nice and do what she was told. "She's 18, strong, quiet." "She'll do just fine," Walt said, his voice low and rough as he spoke to the man with the crooked teeth and the scar down his throat. The man's name was Roy Tellman. He was known in these parts for running freight east through the passes, but folks also whispered about what he did to girls who ended up in his house outside Helena. Perrie tried not to flinch when he looked at her like a man checking the soundness of a horse. Walt's hand landed heavy on her shoulder. "That's cleared, Roy. She's yours." "No," a voice cut through the dry wind. "She ain't." Perrie turned her head. The man who stepped from the saloon was tall, lean, and sunburnt from long days in the saddle. His eyes were a stormy kind of blue, sharp under the brim of his dusty hat. His name was Knox Ellard, a quiet cowboy who had worked on the Bar H ranch for the last 3 years. He had a reputation for keeping to himself, but he was known to be steady, clean with a gun, and kind to horses and children. He looked straight at Roy, not even at Walt. "Your debt's with him, not her. She ain't property." Roy's lip curled. "You buying her out, cowboy? Or just sticking your nose in where it don't belong?" Knox didn't flinch. "I will buy her out." Perrie blinked, heart slamming in her chest. Walt stepped forward. "Boy, you got no idea what kind of debt I owe." Knox reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded bundle of cash. "I sold 2 horses last week. Took the winnings from the rodeo in Butte. This'll cover it." Roy snatched the money, counted it fast, then made a sound like a grunt and turned away. "She's your problem now." Walt didn't look at her. He just climbed back in the wagon and drove off, dust rising behind him like smoke. Perrie stood there, frozen, her breath shallow. Knox looked at her, not the way Roy had, but with something softer. "You all right?" She nodded, but it was a lie. "You got a place to go?" he asked. "No," she said. Her voice cracked. "Not anymore." Knox looked up at the sky, then gently took her carpetbag from her hands. "I got a spare room in my place out at Bar H. You can stay there a while. No one'll bother you." She hesitated. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her again, something real and steady in his eyes. "Because no one should be sold like that. And I do not like the way he looked at you." Perrie followed him. They rode out in silence, the sun sinking low behind the hills. His horse was calm, his pace gentle, and every so often he would glance at her, just to make sure she was still there. By the time they reached his cabin, the moon was rising above the cottonwoods. The place was small, but clean. There was a porch with a rocking chair, and the smell of fresh cut wood lingered in the air. "This is yours?" she asked. "Built it 2 winters ago," he said, unlocking the door. "Not much, but it holds up fine in a storm." Inside, there was a fire already going in the hearth and a kettle warming over it. He showed her to the spare room and set her carpetbag on the bed. "You can stay as long as you need," he said. "No one'll touch you here." She stood there, unsure what to say. No one had ever protected her before, not like that. She had been used to keeping her head down, surviving whatever came. But this man, he did not ask for anything in return. He just handed her safety like it was something she deserved. "I'm not good at saying thank you," she said quietly. "You do not have to," he replied. That night, Perrie lay awake for hours, listening to the wind move through the trees and the faint creak of the porch as Knox sat outside, watching the night. For the first time in a long while, she felt something like safety settle into her chest. The next morning, she found him already up, working on mending a fence out back. He handed her a tin mug of coffee and nodded toward the rising sun. "You sleep all right?" She nodded. Better than I have in a long time. They fell into a rhythm over the next week. She swept the cabin, helped in the garden, and cooked when she could. He never once treated her like she owed him anything. He just worked the land, spoke with kindness, and made space for her to breathe. One afternoon, she found him patching the roof. She climbed the ladder to bring him water, and he looked at her with a grin that warmed her more than the sun. "You climb like you mean it," he said. "I do," she replied, setting the water beside him. He looked at her then, really looked. "You got grit, Perrie. You ever think about staying?" Her heart fluttered. She had tried not to let herself feel anything for him, not after what she had been through. But Knox was different. He saw her, listened to her, never pushed. And now, the idea of leaving him felt harder than staying ever had. "I might," she said. He nodded, eyes never leaving hers. "Then I will make sure it is worth staying for." And she believed him. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm that Perrie hadn't known. She could belong to a life with slow mornings and tasks that left her hands raw but her spirit steadier than it had been in years. She rose early, not from obligation, but because the light through the east-facing window made her want to. Knox never asked her to do anything, but when she picked up a hoe and started in the vegetable rows one morning, he didn't stop her. He only adjusted his pace to match hers. They spoke more now, in pieces over repair work, through fence lines, beside the stream that marked the edge of the Bar H's grazing land. Knox had a way of speaking plain that made silence feel like part of the conversation, not the absence of it. One afternoon, while they were oiling harness leather out by the shed, Perrie asked, "Have you always lived out here?" Knox looked up from the worn strap he was working. "Came west from Missouri after the war. Father didn't make it back. Mother passed the winter after." Perrie didn't ask how. The way he said it told her enough. "What called you here?" she asked. He flexed his fingers, wiped them on a rag. "Quiet. Work that means something. Space to breathe." She nodded. "I never thought I'd end up in Montana." "You still might not," he said, glancing over. "You ever think about leaving?" "I used to. Thought about California when I was younger. Ocean sounded like freedom. But I don't know anymore." He didn't press. Just handed her another length of tack to oil. Later that week, she rode with him to the trading post 3 miles east. It was the first time she'd left the Bar H since arriving. Knox tied his horse outside and helped her down without a word, his hand steady on her elbow, his eyes scanning the street without drawing attention to it. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco and molasses, and the owner, a stern woman named Dorothea Marsh, looked up from her ledger with a sharp nod. "Didn't expect to see you in town, Knox." "Needed salt and kerosene," he said. "And Miss Perrie here could use a few things." Dorothea eyed Perrie with a flicker of something unreadable, then stepped out from behind the counter. "Come on, girl. Let's get you what you need." Perrie followed her through the narrow shelves, fingers brushing the fabric bolts and tin goods. Dorothea handed her a parcel of sewing needles, a comb, and a cake of lye soap without asking if she could pay for them. "You stayin' with Knox?" Perrie hesitated. "For now." Dorothea's gaze softened. "He's solid. My brother rode with him in the '74 cattle drive. Said he's the kind that won't raise his voice unless it's to warn you." That night, Perrie stood on the porch while Knox brushed down his horse. The sky was bruised with dusk, and the wind carried the scent of pine and earth. Dorothea said, "Your name makes the books look better." Knox chuckled low in his throat. "She's got opinions about everything. Why'd you bring me with you?" He looked up from the horse's flank. "Felt like you should see more than just these 4 walls. You've been quiet lately." "I've been thinking," she admitted. "About." She stepped down from the porch and leaned against the post beside him. "What kind of life I want." "What kind of person I want to be." Knox nodded, brushing a hand over the gelding's shoulder. "That's no small thing." She glanced at him. "What about you? You think you'll always be alone out here?" He met her eyes, quiet for a moment. "Didn't always plan to be." Perrie felt something shift between them, an understanding, not yet spoken, but present now, like the warmth that lingers after a fire's burned low. The next morning, she found a wooden box on the table. Inside were a pair of riding gloves stitched from soft buckskin. They weren't new, but they'd been mended with care. She turned to him as he poured coffee. Where'd you get these? He didn't look up. Belonged to my mother. Figured you could use them. How's you been getting raw? Perrie ran her fingers over the seams. Thank you. He nodded once, kept his eyes on the fire. Later, when they rode out to check the north fence, she wore the gloves. The sun was brighter than it had been in days, and Knox rode beside her in silence, his presence steady as the trail beneath their horses. She didn't know what came next, but she knew now that whatever it was, she didn't have to walk it alone. The first rain came slow and steady, soaking the hills and softening the hard edge of the prairie. Knox had gone out before dawn to bring the cattle closer to the southern pasture where the grass stood taller and the ground was less likely to turn to muck. Perrie stayed behind, patching the lining of his winter coat in the warm light of the cabin, the fire low and steady. By midday, the rain hadn't let up. She kept glancing toward the window, listening for hoofbeats, the kind of sound the wet earth swallowed. When the door finally opened, Knox stepped in soaked to the knees, his hat dripping, his jaw tight from the cold. He set his rifle by the door and peeled off his slick coat, water puddling at his boots. You get them all in? She asked, laying the coat across a chair near the hearth. Had to cut a few loose from the gully. One heifer's gone lame. She'll need watching. She poured him a cup of broth from the pot she'd kept simmering. He took it without a word, sipping slow, the steam clouding the air between them. He didn't look up until the cup was nearly empty. You've been quiet today. I had a letter from Mrs. Holt, Perrie said. She took a seat across from him, her hands folded. She heard I was staying out here. Said I could take on some teaching work come September if I wanted. There's a schoolhouse being built down near the Willow Creek Bend. Knox leaned back, his face unreadable. That's something you'd want? I'm not sure yet. I can read and write well enough. Taught some younger ones back home. Before she stopped, eyes lowering. It'd be honest work. He nodded once. You'd be good at it. She traced the rim of her cup with a fingertip. It's strange. I thought when I got free of my father, I'd want to run. Keep going west until I couldn't be followed. But this place doesn't feel like something to run from. Knox set down his cup. You don't owe me anything, Perrie. If you want to leave, I'll help you pack. I know. She looked up, her gaze steady. But I'm not sure I want to. The rain tapped louder on the roof, a rhythm without urgency. He stood then, went to the shelf near the window, and pulled down a wooden box. Inside were folded papers, brittle with age. He handed one to her. My mother's recipe for corn biscuits. She made them every first frost. You mentioned you'd never had any. Perrie took the paper, her thumb brushing the faded ink. Why give this to me? Because I'd like you to stay. Not because you owe me. Just because I'd like it. Her throat tightened. Then I'll learn to make them before September. That night, she stood beside him at the stove, flour dusting the countertop, the two of them working in quiet tandem. When the biscuits came out golden and steaming, they sat at the table and shared them with blackberry preserves he'd brought down from the root cellar. He watched her take the first bite, waited for her reaction. She smiled, slow and soft. I think she'd have liked you. Knox held her gaze. I think she'd have liked you more. They didn't rush anything. There was no need. But when she stood to clear the dishes and his hand brushed hers, she didn't pull away. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The fire burned low, the storm moved on, and the quiet between them held something new, something beginning. By mid-June, the prairie turned wild with color lupin and goldenrod climbing between the grass like they'd waited all year for this brief chance. The river ran clearer, and the mornings came soft, with mist that curled around the base of the pines before burning off by breakfast. Knox had started riding farther north, checking on boundary lines where the cattle sometimes wandered too close to the timber edge. Perrie began tending the young peach trees behind the cabin, careful with the roots, watching them for signs of beetle or mold. She didn't talk much while she worked, but her thoughts settled easier now, not as sharp-edged or scattered. One afternoon, she found Knox seated at the workbench under the awning where the porch met the barn wall. He was reshaping a stirrup, the rasp singing against the wood with each pass. A scrap of cotton hung from his wrist where he'd tied off a shallow cut. I passed 2 riders on the ridge trail this morning, she said, brushing dirt from her hands. Didn't recognize them? He didn't pause in his work. They passin' through? They didn't look like freighters. One had a sharpshooter's scope. Didn't wave. Knox set the rasp aside. Probably bounty men. There's been talk of a Dakota fugitive hiding in the hills west of here. Nothing close, but folks get jumpy. I don't like the way they looked at me. Like they were measuring. He stood then, not hurried, but the shift in him was clear. He took a cloth, wiped his palm clean, and met her eyes. Next time you see someone you don't know, you come get me. I can take care of myself, Knox. I know you can. But I still want you to come get me. Her chest tightened at the way he said it, not with pity, not with doubt, just quiet insistence. She nodded, and he didn't press further. Later that week, they rode out together to the edge of the western pasture, where a pair of steers had broken through the cedar slats. Knox brought nails and a hand axe. Perrie carried a canvas sack with biscuits, dried venison, and a flask of strong tea. They worked without much talking, only the sounds of the prairie wind and the distant creak of grazing cattle filling the space between. As they sat on a flat rock to eat, Perrie turned toward the low hills beyond the split rail fence. "Did you ever think about marrying?" she asked, not looking at him. He chewed slowly, swallowed, then took a sip from the flask. "Once, when I was about 20. She married a banker's son in Kansas City. Said she needed more than dirt and fence posts." Perrie traced the curve of a biscuit in her hand. "Did you love her?" "I thought I did." She nodded, then asked, "And now?" "I think love's quieter than I used to think it was. Doesn't ride in loud. Just settles in beside you day after day until you realize you don't want to go on without it." She looked over at him then. "You think I'd make a decent wife?" He didn't answer right away. He watched her face, the careful way she asked, as if she wasn't sure she wanted the answer even as she needed to hear it. "I think you'd make a better partner than most men I've known could deserve." She felt heat rise in her throat, not from embarrassment, but from the weight of being seen clear through without judgment. "I don't have much to offer," she said, voice low. "You've got more than most. You listen. You work. You don't lie to yourself or to me." The wind stirred her hair across her cheek. She didn't move it. He reached out and tucked the strand behind her ear, his hand lingering a second longer than it needed to. "I think about you," she said, voice barely above the hum of the grass. "Not just here by the fences or the fire, but after. When the school opens. When the peaches ripen. I picture you in all of it." Knox didn't smile. He didn't need to. His hand brushed hers, callous palm against her fingers, and he didn't let go. That night, she didn't sleep in the spare room. They didn't speak of it. She simply stepped into the doorway of his room, and he reached for her like it was the most natural thing the world had ever made. They lay close in the dark, his hand resting at the small of her back, her head tucked beneath his chin. No promises were spoken. None had to be. Outside, the crickets sang, and the world felt still for the first time in years. By late August, the earth had ripened beneath the sun's steady hand, and the fields behind the Bar H cabin gave off the honeyed scent of wind-dried grass. The days passed fast but full, marked by the rhythm of tasks that came with the tail end of summer, stacking cordwood for the colder months, boiling jars for preserves, and checking the roof line before the first frost could test the nails. Perrie moved through it all with quiet certainty, sleeves rolled, braid tucked, eyes sharp. Her body had grown stronger, her steps more sure-footed. She no longer looked like someone surviving, she looked like someone building. Knox had taken to coming in a little earlier each evening, never saying why. Just brushing the dust from his shoulders, stepping inside while the sky still held a trace of light. Perrie didn't press him about it, but she noticed the way he lingered near her when she read by lantern, or how his hands settled naturally on the small of her back when passing behind her. One night, she returned from the creek with a basket of wild mint and found him at the table, bent over a sheet of paper. "You writing someone?" she asked, setting the mint near the window to dry. He folded the paper without looking up. "No. Just finishing something I started a long time ago." She waited, but he didn't offer more, and she didn't push. His hands were ink-stained when he reached for hers. "I want to show you something," he said. They walked out together beneath a sky thick with stars. Knox led her past the barn, across the pasture where the grass whispered around their knees, and up the low slope behind the hayfield. At the top, he stopped. A half-built frame stood there, simple, sturdy. For posts anchored in stone, the beginnings of a roofline traced in cedar beams. "I started it last spring," he said. "Didn't know what for then. Just felt like I ought to be building something with a future in it." She stepped closer, laying her hand on the smooth wood. "What is it?" "It was going to be a storehouse. Maybe a smoke shed. But now, I thought maybe it could be a home. For us." Perrie turned to him, heart thudding. "I know it's plain," he said, "but I figured we could make it what we want. Room for your books. A kitchen that opens to the east. Maybe a porch deep enough for 2 chairs. So I can sit with you when we're old and the winter won't leave us be." She didn't speak, only reached for his hand and pressed it to her chest. Over the place her heart beat steady and full. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said finally. "About not wanting to go on without someone. I don't want to go on without you. I don't want anything without you." Knox cupped her face, thumb brushing the edge of her jaw. "Then stay. Not just here. Stay with me. Be my wife." "I will," she said, voice catching. "I already do in every way that counts." They stood there long after the stars wheeled overhead, wrapped in each other, the scent of mint and earth on the wind. They married under a cottonwood tree on the first Sunday of September. Dorothea Marsh brought a braided loaf and a bottle of elderflower cordial. A ranch hand from the bar H played fiddle while the neighbor's daughter scattered petals from her apron pockets. Knox wore his best shirt, the cuffs still damp from last-minute ironing. Perrie wore a dress she'd sewn from the bolt Dorothea had tucked into her hands, pale blue with a row of tiny buttons she'd stitched by lanternlight. They said their vows with hands clasped and eyes locked, without hesitation or fear. There were no grand declarations, only quiet promises grounded in every ordinary moment they'd already shared. When Knox kissed her, it wasn't a beginning, it was a continuation of what had already rooted deep. Afterward, they walked back to the house they'd finished together. The porch was done now, just as he'd planned, and they sat on it that night with their boots off, watching the last of the guests ride off down the road. "You still think about California?" he asked. She shook her head, leaning into him. "Only when I want to remember how far I've come." He laced his fingers through hers. "You ever wonder what your father would say if he saw this?" She looked out across the land, the fence lines straight, the trees swaying slow in the breeze. "Doesn't matter. He's not here. I am." Knox kissed her temple. "That's all I care about." Time passed the way it does when it's full of things worth holding. The school opened that fall, and Perrie taught reading and arithmetic to children whose hands were often ink-stained and full of questions. She walked home through the fields each evening, the cabin light always visible by the time she reached the edge of the pasture. The peach trees bore fruit the following summer. Small but sweet, Knox built a cradle by hand in the second winter. Sanded every edge smooth, carved a bird into the headboard. Perrie watched him from the doorway, one hand resting on the gentle swell beneath her apron. "I think she's going to have your eyes," she said. He looked up, the firelight catching the lines time had marked into his face. "Then I hope she sees the world the way you do, with patience and grit." They named her Clara, after Perrie's mother. She was born in late March, while the snow still clung to the hills and the creek ran fast with meltwater. Knox held her like he was afraid to breathe too hard, and Perrie, exhausted and full to bursting, laughed softly through her tears. Years passed. The land changed with the seasons, fences shifted, trees grew taller, but the cabin stayed. The porch held. The love between them deepened, quiet and real, stitched into every chore, every sunrise, every hand held beneath the stars. And in that house, with its east-facing kitchen and its 2 chairs on the porch, Perrie and Knox lived out their days not in grand declarations, but in small, steady acts of devotion. Together always, through every storm, through every joy, through every ordinary day that became extraordinary simply because it was shared.